Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It's Wednesday, April 8th, and I'm your host, Tim Clouser, in for Carlene Johnson, who has the day off. In today's episode, one of our reporters will discuss the latest in a legal fight against the state's new income tax, as players on both sides of the aisle line up to oppose the potentially unconstitutional tax. Then, the U.S. Department of Education has rescinded agreements with several school districts that the Trump administration says distorted Title IX to police gender discrimination. The question remains whether this will have any impact on Washington state's own policies. The governor has also faced no recall petition after he failed to fulfill certain statutory duties. We'll also hear from a Republican lawmaker about what's preventing the state from spending climate tax revenues on routine bridge and highway maintenance as conditions deteriorate. The state's new income tax is set to take effect in 2028, with payments beginning in 2029. It targets annual income over $1 million at 9.9% to cover the state's general operating expenses. Voters have rejected an income tax on the ballot 10 times over the last 100 years, but Democrats are hoping that the state Supreme Court will overturn a nearly 100-year-old precedent that could allow this new income tax to proceed. Democrats and Republicans are now joining the fight before a historic shift in the state tax structure. The majority party says the tax will ensure the wealthy pay their fair share, but they were hesitant to say whether or not they would lower the threshold in the future to tax everyday Washingtonians. Here's the Center Square's TJ Martinell, who joined me earlier to discuss this issue. Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clouser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a prominent state Democrat joining the fight against the new state income tax that could hit high earners in the next few years. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about who's joining the fight, a little bit about their history, and why this really matters?
Yeah, so the person who's joining in this legal effort is Phil Talmadge. He is a prominent Democrat who is a former Washington State Supreme Court justice, but he was also a state senator and he was a chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So he's also I've never heard this term before because I'm not in the legal world, but he's been selected as a super lawyer in Washington State numerous times, and this is and so it just goes to show the pedigree that he has legally coming into this legal fight. So that's it's really interesting because the legal team also has former State Attorney General Rob McKenna. So you have a former state attorney general and a former state Supreme Court justice in this legal fight against the income tax. So we're we're really seeing like this is kind of like the 1920 for people who love baseball, the 1927 Yankees or Murderers Row, or you know, you're seeing the top game legally coming to fight this income tax.
We're seeing players from both sides of the aisle. McKenna was a
Right.
Republican, Talmadge a Democrat. I mean, a super attorney. It seems like we're gearing up for what could be a super suit.
Mhm.
I believe in your article you mentioned that Talmadge he has weighed in on an income tax in the past. We know this has been on the ballot. I want to say 10 times over the last 100 years
Yeah.
in Washington State. Most recently, around 2010 or so. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how he ruled at the time?
I mean, so is going as far back as 1933, and I was actually kind of surprised. Talmadge did a analysis of a initiative 1098 from 2010 that would have created a graduated income tax, and it was. I think it's worth bearing in mind how overwhelmingly that in 2010 that initiative was rejected by voters. It was rejected in almost every single precinct in the entire state. There was maybe a handful of precincts in Seattle, like the bluest of the blue accepted voted in favor of this. Everyone else voted against it. So he actually went back as far as 1930. There was a case called Aberdeen Savings and Loan Association v. Chase that is declaring income to be property, and that's going to be the key point or contention that's going to be in this case. So yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that ruling? Because people hear, oh, the income tax is unconstitutional. It's written black and white in the Constitution, but it wasn't in the Constitution in its original form. It came about in 1930. And now this is really the law of the land and what Democrats are hoping, the precedent that they hope to overturn should this hit the Supreme Court later this year or next year. Why don't you tell us about that ruling?
So this is going to be probably one of the most important Supreme Court rulings when if this lawsuit is launched, which is undoubtedly is going to be, because what it's going to get at is the question of whether income is property, and it is almost impossible to argue that it's not for various reasons. Because what they did in the 30s is they wanted to shift the property tax burden away from land and onto other forms of property, but they wanted to tax them at different rates because a property tax is going to be is going to have a different rate than an income tax. So they passed a constitutional amendment. It's the 14th Amendment to the Washington State Constitution, very different from the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. And it said that all forms of property are to be taxed at a uniform rate depending on their class. And they define properties, all things tangible and intangible subject to ownership. So the only way that and what this does, it's important to note, is it makes an income tax by itself, it's constitutional. That's why they passed the voters pamphlet from 1933 or 1930 literally says the argument in favor of the amendment says we want this and we need this so that we can tax income at a different rate than land. And so what they would have to argue, the Supreme Court, in order to say that a progressive income tax is legal, is to say that income is not property. And I talked to a tax attorney probably 10 years ago about this, and he said if the state Supreme Court argued that income is not property under the definition in the 14th Amendment to our Constitution, then it cannot be stolen. Like, the legal implications of that are overwhelming, and I'd be interested in hearing what the arguments are gonna be made in front of the Supreme Court, particularly about Talmadge, because he used to sit on it, but that's gonna have to be their question is income property? Do you own your income? And I'm the legal argument to say that you don't, and I'm sure that somebody's gonna try and say that we're not taxing your money, we're taxing the transfer of money, which they call, they did it with the capital gains excise tax or income tax, which they
Mhm.
call an excise tax, but it's an income tax. And that's how they got around not having to address the issue of whether income is property. With this bill, with this law, they can't get around that. The Supreme Court will have to address the question of whether or not income is property. So having Rob McKenna, having Phil Talmadge on this legal team, you're going to have people who are as well versed in the constitutional history, not to mention the fact that the Supreme Court of the state has unanimously, consistently over the last 80, 90 years said that income is property. So this Supreme Court is going to have to explain why 90 years of legal precedent was wrong. So that is the stakes that are at play here with this lawsuit, this impending lawsuit.
Yeah, and we're talking 90 to 100 years, coming up on 100 years of this legal precedent, deeply rooted in our state's history and constitution at this point. But at the same time, Washington, until this income tax takes effect in the coming years, it's one of, I believe, around 8 or 10 states across the country that does not have an income tax yet. Many of the states that do have an income tax do not treat income as property. I mean, how could that impact this fight? I know Washington State is different than those, but since other states don't consider income as property, could that play a role in the Supreme Court's decision when they take up this case?
The problem is that our Constitution has the broadest definition of property, and this was acknowledged in the original 1933 uh, uh, decision that overturned a progressive income tax that was passed by the state. They just said we have the broadest definition of property you could possibly imagine. There is no way that income cannot fall underneath this definition. And if and I think that that's a problem is that they got to get around the Constitution. They can't cite other states' legal precedents because it's not applicable because they don't have our Constitution. They don't have our definition of property,
Mhm.
and they also don't have the uniform clause when it comes to property uh, classes. So our property taxes have to be the same no matter where you are in the state as far as rates are concerned. That may not be the case in other states, but they're not ruling on other what they. Unlike our fuel efficiency standards of that advanced clean trucks and advanced clean cars policies, we can't adopt policies from other states and say that that applies to us. The state Supreme Court has to look at the Washington state constitution and say, okay, either income is property underneath this definition or it's not. And if it's not, we have to explain why. And they have to say
Mhm.
subject to own. And yeah, it doesn't say explicitly that you own your income, but then the question is who does own your income? And if
Mhm.
nobody owns it, then nobody can steal it. I mean, that's that would mean that somebody could go steal the income of the state Supreme Court justices, and it wouldn't be considered theft because it's not property. I mean, can you imagine the legal fight that would ensue if somebody stole their money and said it's income and it's not property? Like that, and that would raise other questions of what's the difference between wealth and income in that sense. So,
Mhm.
yeah, and I'm sure that some people will say, well, here's the legal difference. There's wealth, that's what you own, income, what you earn, wealth is what you already have. I get that, but this just raises this would open up uh the legal discussion to. I think they would also have to explain why the other Supreme Court just prior Supreme Courts were wrong. I think that's they got 90
Mhm.
years of saying, yeah, they said this for 100 years, and here's why we think they're wrong. Here's something we discovered that's new and changes everything in that regard. This is where it's going to be very fascinating to have a former state Supreme Court justice on not on the bench, but sitting in front of them and probably knowing I would dare to say probably knowing as much, if not more, than they probably know on this topic because he's written about it so
Mhm.
extensively, and it's obviously he's getting involved because he wants to be involved in this legal fight. And so that's going to be a very different, I'd say, oral argument if he's going to participate in that.
Mhm. This is definitely a very pivotal moment in state history and in our state's tax structure. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. We're talking about this legal challenge that's building up, potentially to hit the Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of the income tax. But at the same time, we have efforts trying to get it on the ballot. I mean, the Democrats wrote in this clause that makes it quote unquote referendum proof, so voters can't take it to the ballot to potentially reject it before it takes effect. And it is supposed to take effect in 2028, with first payments being in 2029. But a lot of moving parts here. The Supreme Court could weigh in as soon as the end of this month on potentially whether or not we could see this hit a referendum. That would require about 145 or 150,000 signatures before June 10th for that to go on a future ballot. But even at that point, if voters approve it and it stays in place or rejects it, the Supreme Court could then come in later and rule on this case that Talmadge is joining with McKenna and others to challenge the constitutionality. So, I mean, even if voters do approve it in that off chance, I mean, we saw overwhelming opposition when there was hearings in the state legislature. So we'll see how that turns out if it does land on the ballot. But if the Supreme Court rules against it, we could have another situation where, say, when the income tax first came on the ballot, prior to 1930, voters actually passed it before the state Supreme Court came in and said, no, this isn't going to work. And they overturn that. But definitely interesting to see how this will all play out in the coming months and years. I mean, TJ, how long do we expect this lawsuit challenging the constitutionality? How long do we expect this to take before we see a Supreme Court decision? Could it be months, or are we talking
I mean,
years?
that's gonna be the question is how long this fight's gonna play out and how long they're gonna wanna kick the can down. I think the biggest question is who's gonna wanna drag this out longer than the other. Because once there's a ruling, you know, that all bets are off as far as either way. But I'd say that I think it's interesting that the legislature decided to have the tax take effect as far as collecting the revenue for several years. And so that would indicate one could argue that indicates that they aren't as confident in it being upheld as they would otherwise think. Because if they
Well,
knew for sure it was going to be upheld, one could argue that they would have just said, you know what, let's immediately start collecting the tax. It's going to get
mhm,
upheld, no worries. Either that, or they're trying to figure out what the effect is going to be on people. I've written stories and others with our news organization on how people with wealth and income are leaving the state. And I don't mean in a literal sense. What they're doing is they're shifting their state residency to other states that have no income tax and don't have a wealth tax or an estate tax. And so, they'll stay in the state for 5 months. Then 6 months later, when it's about to be 6 months, they'll go somewhere else and live there for the rest of the year, and the state's not going to get the revenue it wants. And so the question is, how long does the tax on millionaires remain a tax only on millionaires?
And we know that Democrats repeatedly throughout the legislative session were hesitant, did not say whether or not they would lower that threshold in future legislatures, saying they didn't want to construe those legislatures. But TJ, thank you for diving into this. This will definitely be something that we put a lot of focus on in the coming months and years. And for those hoping to read TJ's stories, you can catch it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus. The U.S. Department of Education has rescinded agreements from prior administrations that the DOE says distorted Title IX to police discrimination on the basis of gender identity. The order impacts 5 school districts and 1 college, including Washington's Fife School District. Title IX is a 1972 civil rights law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in education and sports. DOE alleges that prior federal administrations illegally placed Title IX violations on these school districts for misusing the student's preferred gender pronouns or asking about the student's preferred gender. The Trump administration says Title IX protections are based on sex, so the districts aren't in violation. The Biden administration implemented a Title IX rule in 2024 that expanded the scope to include gender related provisions, which the Trump administration reversed in January 2025. This week's order follows several moves from the Trump administration to eliminate DEI programs and ensure that biological males aren't competing in sports against biological females. Parental rights advocates might consider this a win, but the DOE order might not have much of an effect in Washington state. State law still prohibits discrimination in public schools based on gender expression and identity, meaning that Washington still requires 5 to have transgender student policies aligned with the state, despite concerns from parents and young girls about boys in the locker room. The issue is that the Trump administration is taking a different stance that puts federal funding at risk. The Department of Education is already investigating the state over conflicting Title IX policies, and the Trump administration has already sued states like Maine and California. So we could see another legal fight mounting in Washington state over compliance and federal funding. Next, Washington State Governor Bob Ferguson is facing a recall petition. Olympia attorney Connor Edwards filed the petition on April 1st after Ferguson failed to fill 2 seats on the state's Public Disclosure Commission. State law provides the governor with 30 days to fill vacancies on the 5-day commission, which acts as the state's campaign finance watchdog. 1 seat has been vacant since January 2025, with another sitting empty since last August. The commission can operate with 3 members, but if someone resigns, is sick, or is otherwise unable to attend a meeting, it hamstrings the panel's ability to hold hearings and make decisions. Edwards described the recall petition as a pressure tactic to get Ferguson to fill the 2 empty seats. He told the Center Square that if Ferguson fills these seats, he'll withdraw the recall petition. The Reason Foundation's 29th annual highway report recently ranked Washington state dead last in 3 categories. The report suggests that taxpayers are spending far more than they are getting in return. The study's author told the Center Square that state management and prioritization are major issues. He said that climate tax revenues being used for ferry electrification and other projects could be better spent on maintaining the state's roads and bridges, warning that Washington state is entering a quote-unquote maintenance death spiral. However, state law prohibits lawmakers from using the Climate Commitment Act to fund routine road and bridge work. Representative Andrew Barkis, the top Republican who writes the transportation budgets with the Democratic majority, recently sat down with me to discuss his counterpart's unwillingness to open up the CCA. What were the negotiations like with the majority this session in terms of expanding the potential uses for the CCA, if at all?
Frustrating. So I've been the ranking member on the House Transportation Committee for 8 years now. I think 8 years since 2018. Um, so I've written a lot of budgets. I've dealt with a lot of issues. I've been crying about priorities and maintenance and preservation, all the things that all of a sudden this year are like, the governor's, newfound issue. I think it was shortly after the CCA came into play, and we were looking at what it was the allocated uses of the money. Move Ahead Washington was the big Democrat, one of the first partisan transportation packages, and it was all using CCA. So this is when you really saw where they were going to spend it on: active transportation, transit, electrification, you name it. We were facing budget, shortfalls, increasing costs, and everything else. So I put forth a piece of legislation a couple of years ago saying, hey, let's use a percentage of CCA for limited use. No. And then came back. Let's look at when we have surplus. So, for example, when they do these auctions, everyone has created more revenue than what was uh, um, um, uh, um, anticipated or in statute, right? So the cost went up on the auction. State gets a couple hundred million more dollars. I'm like, hey, why don't we use a percentage of that directly into transportation for maintenance and preservation? No. So continuing to put that. Then I tried again in the various legislation and in the budget work to again reprioritize and say, okay, well, let's look at nexuses of climate related type of situation. Fairfax Bridge was a perfect example. Deteriorated due to the climate. So, let's use a portion of that money to replace that bridge. No. Uh, let's use a portion of the CCA for climate related transportation disaster. We had the big storm in December, all those roads wiped out, and everything else. Let's use that money. So the theme, Tim, is the same. We cannot use CCA for anything beyond what is in statute and directly related to carbon reduction, because that's what the people want. I disagree. Um, we saw this as the budget, the operating budget, and everything else unfolded. They have one allowable use in there, which I didn't even know until I dug further, for the working families tax credit. And they were going to pull 500 and some odd million dollars out of CCA, backfill working families tax, replace that money into CCA from the left one, hijack. So, I mean, they're kind of talking on both sides of their mouth, right? Um, I think that we absolutely should reprioritize it. It is a tax. People are paying this tax at the gas pump. I think the most recent statistic was about 62 cents, not including the other one for, the clean fuel standard, which is about another 20 cents. So people are paying this. And, everybody I've talked to, my constituents and people all throughout the state, if I bring up using that, nobody says, no, you can't do that. The only people that say that are climate solutions or the transit folks or, active transportation people, people that are receiving the benefits, the massive benefits of the hundreds of millions of dollars that are pouring out of this fund.
I mean, do these electrification projects, I understand that they offer these big, um, they can help us reach these climate goals, but at what cost? You're going to end up spending way
Well,
more down the road.
it's what we've been shouting ever since I've been in the legislature and in particular in this role. And, it's not just transportation. I mean, we could talk about housing. We could talk about all sorts of things. We had a governor for 12 years whose number one priority was the climate, right? Over and above everything else. And I would say the state suffered dramatically, right? Increasing spending cost to everything, regulatory burden, you name it. It just didn't get any better. It's more expensive. The affordability index, I mean, all the statistics they don't lie. And in the same breath, he was also the governor, during that time with transportation. One of the biggest examples is our ferry system. When I first started, we negotiated the ferry system. We negotiated Vigor to build another boat. They just built two boats back in 2010, 2012, or somewhere in there. Had the contract, had the design. Boats were going to cost about, somewhere between 120 and 140 million, right? And in 2018, 2019, the governor signs an executive order to say, no, to meet his climate goals, we have to electrify the fleet. We have no boats in the water. We're building one in Florida now because we can't build them here. We're building these hybrid, electric boats, hundreds and billions of dollars. These boats are going to cost close to $500 million a piece. So take that as an example. Go back to $140 million. That difference, that 360 million, what do you use that for? Maintenance and preservation, building other things, infrastructure, capacity. What do there's your reason, article talking about highest and best use. When I've been yelling prioritization as loud as I can yell in the Capitol, and it falls on deaf ears because they just keep getting the dollars to do different things. I'll give you another example. I also have been one quoted and said for many, many times, the age of transportation revenue packages is gone, is done, it's antiquated. That's the political aspect, right? 2015 Connecting Washington. That project list was not necessarily developed on a list of priorities of like, hey, we better fix all this stuff first. No, it was like, hey, Tim, I need your vote to pass this revenue package for 10-cent gas tax. So in your district, you're going to get a tunnel or a bridge or whatever. It looked throughout the state. There's so much of that. Now, there's a lot of those projects that were done that were necessity, right? The capacity 520 bridge. I wouldn't say the tunnel downtown Seattle was necessarily a necessity, right? But but a lot of the other projects were peppered throughout the state, and maintenance and preservation was not taken into consideration. So the fault lies squarely with the majority. The fault lies squarely with the previous governor. And I would say now on this governor, even though he proposed, hey, we're going to spend all this money. What are we doing in order to do that? Reason why I was a no. Bonding, right? Bonding is a tool that we should save for the big issues that we're going to be facing in the future, not to backfill, with more debt so we can do maintenance and preservation. There is money within the budget if we use the Climate Commitment Act, right? If I could take the 300 million that is a line item over X amount of years in the Move Ahead plan for bicycle education and safety programs, 50 million a biennium. Wrap your head around that. I mean, that's a lot of money, right? So you look at all of these various things that are going on. Fish culvert, fish passage. We're spending billions of dollars on fish passage, right? And we're not even sure what it's going to take to finish that program, if ever. So yeah, I mean they're spot on. The political aspect of it, the prioritization. It's just like Fairfax Bridge. The reason why that became such a big deal to me is because it's the epitome of failure by the agency and the majority, because they knew that bridge was failing. They knew 20 years ago. The reports 20 years ago said it needed X, Y, and Z. It needed painting. It needed everything. The agency never asked for that. They never put a specific request across my desk to say, hey, this year we need $10 million extra in order to fix the Fairfax Bridge, or it's going to fail. It just failed. I mean, their response was close it, right? And now it's like, oh, now we got to spend 100 and whatever it is million to replace it. So it is a problem, and it is until we have that political will or a change in the makeup of the legislature, we're going to be in this type of situation. I appreciate the fact that governor and my colleagues on the left and the majority, recognizes. But I would say that that's been a priority for Chair Fye and I as the ranking and chair of the House Transportation Committee. And we haven't been peppering projects, although we've been just trying to balance and run a transportation budget that keeps the state moving. But we're far from doing what needs to be done.
And what's the consequences for prioritizing one of those priorities over another? Like, say, these fish passage projects or a $1 billion electrification project over routine maintenance?
Well, fish passage is paid out of multimodal and other things. We've argued to use CCA on that, but that's another one that's kind of interesting, right? Not allowable. But when you look at the amount of money going to transit, for example, right? Transit should be self-sustaining. Most transit are either city, regional, county, some kind of a taxing district to support themselves. You have a fare box you're supposed to have. But you've gotten away from that because as soon as they could tap into state money, and then when the CCA came into play and it's an allowable use, no more fare box, free rides for everybody. and they're all subsidized by the state, King County Metro and everything. And you'll hear them say, "Oh, we don't have enough money." But they've expanded transit to a point where this is supposed to get people out of their cars, right? That's the theory. Transit ridership is not increasing. Even sound transit. I mean, talk about a boondoggle. I mean, there now you're getting into billions of dollars.
Hmm.
Um, but that's a transit. Active transportation. Um, walking, riding, and rolling is what they say. So we're dedicating hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to urban trails and facilities, and we've changed how we build our highways with complete streets. So again, take all that money, and I sat down and did an exercise with some folks, many different groups in my office in the last two budget cycles, and I literally found $1 billion of money in existing CCA dollars, still using CCA for still funding transit and regional grants and all that stuff. But $1 billion I felt could go elsewhere. $1 billion, right? And even if we allocated half that to maintenance preservation, it's exactly what we did this year. But if you take a look at all the other stuff, the agencies should be prioritizing this. The agencies should be prioritizing how they get a bucket of money, Tim. We fill up a program I or program P, which is preservation. We fill it up with hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And then the agency, WashDOT, they're the ones that prioritize however they do that through their list and their regions and everything else. But they, according to them, recently, they're now saying, well, we've just never received enough money. We've never had the appropriations necessary to keep on top of paving and fixing these bridges and painting bridges and everything else. And my response was, well, why didn't you make it a priority? Why aren't you telling us that? I mean, I actually have a proviso in this budget, this budget that we just did, the supplemental, saying, I want a list of all the bridges and I want them prioritized so we know what we're facing, not just some random number or thing. We need to know so we can start to appropriate and make sure that the money is going in the proper places. But they have a paving program, they have a chip seal, they have a pothole thing, and if you get down to the local level of cities and counties, they're in the same boat. They're in trouble too because they don't have the money. Now, there's a lot of things that also are affecting our ability to do this, and it's not just the revenue, it's the expense side of the ledger, right? The regulatory burden, the changes in, like I said, complete streets, the HEAL Act, environmental justice, Native American consultation now on everything. You start adding all these layers on, becomes very expensive to fill a pothole, becomes very expensive to paint a bridge. You can only work in the water so many months out of the year. You can't do stuff because of the salmon aspect. When you paint a bridge, you can't just go out and paint it. You've got to do an environmental review on that project before you go do that.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even clean a ditch without doing an environmental review to make sure that it's not going to impact whatever. So you have on that side, of course, the costs have gone up extremely high in these projects. So it's out of balance. And from my perspective, somebody that, lives this thing every single day of my legislative work, I can see a path to fix it. I can see a path to reprioritize it. I can see a path to use the existing resources. But, we just got some of our recent stats, and almost $1.50 a gallon of our gas right now is taxes. Third highest, I think I would argue is probably the second highest in the nation. And, are people feeling like they're getting their money's worth? No.
That's it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. To read more, check out thecentersquare.com. I'm your host, Tim Clouser, and I'll see you next time.